In the spring of 1919, a letter arrived at a New Orleans newspaper. Its author claimed to be a demon from the depths of hell. He said he'd already killed, and he promised to kill again, on one specific night, unless the entire city did exactly what he asked. What he wanted wasn't money. It wasn't silence. He wanted jazz. And on March 19, 1919, New Orleans gave it to him. New Orleans in 1918 was already a city on edge, gripped by wartime rationing, a spreading influenza epidemic, and now a killer moving through its streets at night, one axe at a time. By the time it was over, the attacks attributed to him would span more than a year, leave at least half a dozen people dead, and terrorize a city that prided itself on never being afraid of anything. Newspapers gave him a name before police ever gave investigators a suspect. They called him the Axeman. No one ever learned who he really was. This is the story of the killings, the letter, and the one night an entire American city decided that music was the only thing standing between them and a murderer. It's a story with confirmed victims, a real letter still held in newspaper archives today, and a mystery that outlived every single person who lived through it. 2 years earlier, in May of 1918, someone broke into the home of Joseph and Catherine Maggio, grocers in the city's Italian community at the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets. It was an ordinary corner store of the kind that filled uptown New Orleans at the time, a small grocery and bar room combined, with the family's living quarters just behind the counter. Both were attacked while they slept, their throats cut with a straight razor, then struck again with an axe. Catherine died almost instantly. Joseph lived long enough to be found by his own brothers, who lived next door, and heard strange sounds through the wall nearly 2 hours later. He died only minutes after they reached him. News of the killing spread through the neighborhood before the sun was fully up, and within days it had reached every newspaper in the city. The killer hadn't taken anything of value. Money and valuables sat untouched in plain sight. He'd used an axe that belonged to the couple themselves and a razor pulled from inside their own home, and left both behind. Investigators found something else near the scene. A panel had been chiseled out of the back door, cut just large enough for a person to crawl through. It wasn't the last time that detail would show up. A block away, police found something even stranger, a message written in chalk on the sidewalk. It read, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." No one in the department could explain what it meant, or who Mrs. Tony was supposed to be. Some believed it referenced an unsolved attack from years earlier, though no one could ever confirm the connection. For a few days, suspicion fell on Andrew Maggio, Joseph's brother, a barber whose straight razor turned out to be the murder weapon. He was questioned for hours and eventually broke down in tears, insisting he'd been nowhere near the house that night. He was released 2 days later. Within the week, 3 separate acquaintances of the Maggios were brought in for questioning and released just as quickly, and the investigation was already faltering. The case and the chalk message went unexplained. The grocery stayed closed for weeks afterward, one more shuttered storefront in a neighborhood that would soon have several. It would not be the last unexplained detail New Orleans police were left holding that year. The city barely had time to recover before it happened again. Nearly every victim ran a small, family-operated grocery, the kind of business that had become common across the city's large Italian immigrant community, often with a cash box behind the counter and living quarters just steps away. On June 27, 1918, grocer Louis Bessemer and his companion, Harriet Lowe, were attacked in their home at the corner of Dorgenois and La Harpe Streets. Bessemer's skull was fractured. He survived. In the paranoid climate of a country at war, police initially wondered whether Bessemer, a man of foreign birth, might himself be a German spy, and searched his home for evidence of espionage instead of evidence of his attacker. They found nothing. Lowe did not recover as easily. Partially paralyzed by the blow, she lived for another 6 weeks, and in that time, her account of what happened kept changing. Eventually, on what would turn out to be her deathbed, she named Bessemer himself as her attacker. He was arrested and held for nearly a year before finally standing trial. The jury took 10 minutes to acquit him. By then, it was already too late to matter to the investigation. The real attacker, whoever he was, had moved on. On August 5th, a pregnant woman named Mary Schneider woke to find a dark figure standing over her bed. She was struck repeatedly in the face before her attacker fled into the night. She survived. 2 days later, she gave birth to a healthy daughter. 5 days after that, on August 10th, an elderly grocer named Joseph Romano was attacked in his sleep. His nieces, waking to the sound of a struggle in the next room, ran in just in time to see a figure escaping through the same kind of chiseled door panel. It was a detail that would repeat itself so often over the following year that residents began treating any missing door panel as a warning sign in itself. They described him as heavy-set, dark-skinned, wearing a dark suit and a slouched hat, a description that would circulate through the city for months without ever leading anywhere. Romano died 2 days later. Each new attack made the previous one feel less like an isolated tragedy and more like the opening chapters of something the city didn't yet have a name for. By the end of the summer of 1918, New Orleans was no longer just uneasy. It was in a state of open panic, fed by newspaper headlines that grew more sensational with every attack, and by a police department that seemed no closer to an answer than it had been in May. What made the case so unsettling wasn't just the violence, it was how little of it made sense. There was no theft in a single one of the attacks. There was no clear connection between the victims beyond their profession and, in most cases, their Italian heritage. Police floated a theory that the killings were tied to the city's Black Hand, the extortion rackets that had long preyed on immigrant business owners. The Black Hand wasn't a single organization so much as a loose pattern of extortion letters and threats that had plagued Italian-run businesses in American cities for years, New Orleans included. Maybe this was intimidation. Maybe it was revenge on someone who'd refused to pay. But the theory never quite held together. Some of the victims had no ties to organized crime at all. Others had received no threats, no warning, nothing before the axe came through their door. Under mounting pressure from the public and the press, the police department assigned additional detectives to the case, with little to show for it. Detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses, cross-referenced years of police reports, and consulted with criminologists from as far away as New York, all without producing a single solid lead. With official explanations failing to hold up, residents turned to whatever protection they could find. Some families began sleeping with the lights on. Others reportedly followed old superstitions passed down through the city's diverse communities, scattering brick dust across their doorsteps or burning candles through the night. None of it stopped the attacks. Whoever the killer was, he seemed to choose his victims for reasons only he understood. And he always got in the same way, through a door, quietly taken apart, one panel at a time. Newspaper editorials openly criticized the department, some calling for a reward fund, others calling for the police superintendent's resignation outright. By early 1919, detectives working the case privately admitted they had no stronger a lead than they'd had 8 months earlier. Then, in March of 1919, the case took its strangest turn yet. A letter arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune, addressed to the people of New Orleans. Whoever wrote it claimed responsibility for every attack and claimed to be something other than a man. He wrote that he came from the pits of hell itself and signed the letter simply as the Axeman. The letter's language was theatrical almost to the point of parody, full of biblical fire and brimstone imagery, and unmistakably meant to be read by as many people as possible. The letter was reprinted across the city's newspapers within a day, and by word of mouth long before that. The letter set a date, Tuesday, March 19th, and it made an offer. If jazz music was playing in a home when the clock struck the hour of his arrival that night, he wrote, that home would be spared. He claimed to love jazz above all things on earth. Whether the letter was genuinely written by a killer or was a hoax dreamed up during a citywide panic by someone looking to sell newspapers has never been settled. Some read it and laughed it off as theater. Others took it as seriously as a knock at their own front door. But New Orleans didn't wait to find out. On the night of March 19, 1919, New Orleans did something no city had ever done before, and none has done since. Dance halls sold out within hours of the letter reaching print. Record stores that had sold a handful of jazz records a week reported selling out entirely within hours that afternoon. An unplanned boom no one had predicted. Bands were booked into private homes for the night at premium rates money couldn't normally buy, some musicians playing 3 or 4 different houses before sunrise. Families with no musical talent at all banged on pots and pans, pulled out old phonograph records, or simply stood in open doorways playing whatever they could find loud enough for the street to hear. Neighbors who barely spoke to one another otherwise borrowed records back and forth, desperate not to be the one house left in silence. For one single night, the entire city was, by design, impossible to ignore. Every house lit up, every window rattling with sound. Restaurants and saloons that normally closed by midnight stayed open until dawn, packed with people who had nowhere else they'd rather be than somewhere loud. And that night, for the first time in nearly a year, no one in New Orleans was attacked. Decades later, some of the city's musicians would still talk about that night when, for a few hours, playing loud wasn't just performance, it was survival. By morning, what had started as a desperate response to a killer's threat had become something the city would talk about for generations. One of the strangest nights in its history, and, unintentionally, one of the strangest tributes jazz music has ever received. The relief didn't last. The killings resumed within weeks and continued through the rest of the year. The final victim, widely attributed to the Axeman, was a grocer named Mike Pepitone, attacked in his home in October of 1919. He did not survive. His wife, Esther, was in the house at the time and would later say she caught only a glimpse of a fleeing figure, never enough to identify him. In the years that followed, nearly every early suspect from 1918, including Andrew Maggio and Louis Bessemer, had long since been cleared, leaving investigators with no one left to point to at all. For a brief period, the department believed the case had finally, quietly, resolved itself in a city 2,000 miles away. History would prove far less certain. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, 13 months of terror simply stopped. More than a year later, in December of 1920, in Los Angeles, over 1,000 miles from New Orleans, a man named Joseph Mumphrey was shot dead on a street corner by a woman named Esther Albano. Albano had been married to Mike Pepitone and had since remarried and moved across the country. She claimed she recognized Mumphrey as the man who had killed her husband and that she'd killed him in revenge, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. The Los Angeles courtroom that tried Albano became, briefly, almost as much a subject of national fascination as the original New Orleans case had been. She was convicted of manslaughter. Then, after new information emerged suggesting the case against Mumphrey was far shakier than it first appeared, she was paroled after serving only a fraction of her sentence. No physical evidence ever tied Mumphrey conclusively to a single attack in New Orleans. Officially, to this day, the case was never solved. So what actually happened in New Orleans across those 13 months? Some historians believe it genuinely was one man, a serial killer targeting a specific community for reasons only he ever understood. Others think the pattern is too inconsistent for a single killer, and that at least some of the attacks were copycats, or were tied to the Black Hand after all, staged to look like the work of one man in order to spread fear that would keep victims paying quietly rather than going to police. And some believe the letter itself was never written by a killer at all, that a city, primed by over a year of terror, simply agreed to believe a story and lit itself up in music because believing felt better than the alternative of admitting no one was any closer to an answer. Modern researchers have spent decades combing through the surviving case files, and even they remain split on which theory comes closest to the truth. What's certain is this. On one night in March of 1919, an entire American city took a threat from an unidentified killer seriously enough to fill its own streets with music. And for one night, whatever the letter really was, it worked. What almost no one disputes is that for 13 months, an American city lived under the shadow of someone it never saw coming and never saw leave. And whoever the Axeman really was, across at least 6 confirmed attacks, and possibly more never conclusively linked to him, he was never caught, never named, and never explained.